In the penthouse of New York's Sovereign Hotel, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and quiet authority, Clara Hayes moved like a ghost. Believing the lavish suite to be empty, she stepped into the marble-clad bathroom, her cleaning cart a silent witness to the opulence she maintained but never touched. Steam, smelling of sandalwood and something distinctly masculine, clung to the air. And then she saw him. A man stood with his back to her, water dripping from his shoulders onto the pristine floor. As he turned, his body, a roadmap of scars that spoke of a brutal life, was completely bare. Her breath caught in her throat, not a scream, but a sharp, silent intake of air. His eyes, the color of cold steel, found hers, and in that crushing silence, her world stopped turning. But what happened in that silent bathroom would shatter her world, and if you watch until the end, you'll discover the vow that sealed her fate. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Clara Hayes was 26, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her seem older. For 2 years, she had been a housekeeper on the night shift, an invisible entity polishing the gilded cage of Manhattan's elite. Her movements were economical and precise, a quiet choreography of dignity learned through necessity. Each folded towel, each wiped surface was an act of defiance against the chaos of her own life. She was a woman built of silent resilience, her moral compass a heavy, unwavering anchor in a sea of solitude. She didn't dream of a better life anymore. She simply focused on surviving this one meticulously cleaned room at a time, her spirit intact but fraying at the edges. Her reality was a collection of quiet pressures that suffocated her slowly. There was her shift manager, a man whose compliments felt like threats, his gaze lingering too long on her as she pushed her cart down the silent, opulent hallways. Then there were the debts, a mountain left behind by her late father's failed business, a constant weight that dictated every choice she made. Her small apartment felt less like a home and more like a holding cell between shifts. This oppressive quiet was her world, a stark contrast to the effortless power she witnessed every night. A power wielded by men in expensive suits who decided fates over glasses of whiskey, never once noticing the woman who cleaned up after them. The Sovereign Hotel was a symphony of muffled sounds she had learned to interpret. The distant clinking of glasses from the rooftop bar, the soft chime of the elevator announcing another guest's arrival, the hushed, urgent voices of security speaking into their wrists. For Clara, it was a world seen through reflections, in polished marble floors, gleaming silver trays, and the dark, unblinking windows that looked out over a city of a million lights she couldn't reach. The air itself felt different on the penthouse floor, thinner and charged with an unspoken authority. She felt like a ghost haunting a life that was not hers, forever on the outside of the warmth and the light, a silent observer of a world that would crush her if she ever stepped out of line. She carried a deep-seated sense of justice, a painful inheritance from her father, a good man ruined by a handshake deal with a wolf in sheep's clothing. This memory was the source of her quiet strength and her profound distrust of wealth and power. She watched the hotel's powerful guests, not with envy, but with a keen, discerning eye, noticing the fear behind a powerful man's smile or the deep loneliness in a beautiful woman's laughter. This empathy was her burden and her shield. It kept her human in a place that valued currency over character, reminding her that behind every display of power was a fragile, flawed person. It was this very quality that made her both invisible and dangerously perceptive. She had seen him before, the man from the bathroom, Dante Moretti. His name was never spoken above a whisper by the staff, a ghost of a name that carried the weight of fear and a strange, reluctant respect. He would move through the lobby in a perfectly tailored dark suit, a figure of absolute stillness in a world of constant motion. He commanded rooms without a word, his presence a void that pulled all light and sound into it. His gaze swept over everything and saw it all, yet he never seemed to see her. To him, she was just another part of the hotel's machinery, as inanimate as the crystal chandeliers. But she had felt the chill of his passage, a premonition of a power so immense it felt like a law of nature. Tonight, the air on the penthouse floor was different, charged with a palpable tension. The usual security detail was doubled, their postures rigid, their eyes scanning every shadow. The silence was not peaceful, but predatory, the kind that precedes a storm. Clara, her mind on the end of her shift and the promise of a few hours of dreamless sleep, dismissed the feeling as fatigue-induced paranoia. The final suite on her list, registered to a shell corporation, was meant to be unoccupied. She approached the heavy oak door, her keycard in hand. She didn't know it then, but she was about to step through a doorway from which there was no return, into a silence far more dangerous than any she had ever known. The ride home was a descent from one world into another. The sterile luxury of the Sovereign gave way to the grimy reality of the 4 a.m. City bus, its fluorescent lights casting a sickly pallor on the faces of the exhausted. Clara leaned her head against the vibrating window, the skyline a distant, glittering promise she no longer believed in. Her gray uniform, stiff with industrial starch, felt less like work attire and more like a costume for a role she was forced to play, the invisible woman. Each stop brought on more weary travelers, their collective sighs filling the still air. This was the true New York, the one that powered the penthouses but slept in cramped apartments. A city of bone-deep fatigue and forgotten dreams, a world away from sandalwood-scented steam. Her apartment was a small third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that never truly slept, the sounds of distant sirens and neighbors' arguments seeping through the thin walls. It was her sanctuary and her cage. A single window looked out onto a brick wall, a constant reminder of her confinement. The space was sparse but immaculate, a testament to her need for order in a life defined by chaos. On a small, worn nightstand sat a framed photograph of her parents. Their smiles from a time before illness and debt had stolen the light from their eyes. This room was the only place she could breathe, but even here, the silence was heavy, filled with the ghosts of bills she couldn't pay and a future she couldn't imagine. The debts were a suffocating inheritance, the final, cruel legacy of her father. He had been a carpenter, a man who built things with his hands and his heart, until he signed a contract with a developer who bled his small company dry and vanished. The memory of his defeat, the way his shoulders slumped lower each day, was a wound Clara carried for him. It was the source of her quiet fury, a deep-seated distrust of the men in $1,000 suits who moved through the Sovereign Hotel like gods, oblivious to the lives they shattered with the stroke of a pen. She polished their marble floors, but in her heart she saw the cracks in their gilded foundations, the moral rot beneath the shine. Her mother was the anchor that held her in place. Living in a small assisted care facility upstate, her health was a fragile, expensive thing. Every paycheck of Clara's was a delicate balancing act. Rent, food, her own meager needs, and the remainder sent to ensure her mother had the best care she could afford. This responsibility was a chain forged of love and duty, keeping her tethered to the night shift at the Sovereign. There was no room for error, no possibility of quitting, no space to dream of the life she once wanted as an architect, designing buildings instead of just cleaning them. Her mother's well-being was the non-negotiable truth of her existence, the reason she endured every quiet humiliation with her head held high. The primary source of that humiliation was her shift manager, Mr. Henderson. He was a man who wielded his minor authority like a weapon, his smiles never quite reaching his cold, appraising eyes. His compliments on her work were always followed by a comment on her appearance, his gaze lingering a moment too long, making her skin crawl. He would find reasons to call her into his office, his questions about her personal life thinly veiled attempts to breach her carefully constructed walls. She navigated his presence with a practiced, polite detachment, her silence a shield against his creeping advances.
But each encounter left her feeling diminished, a fresh layer of grime on her spirit that no shower could wash away. In the quietest hours of her shift, when the hotel slept and the hallways were long canyons of silence, Clara allowed herself to dream. She would pause before the architectural prints that lined the corridors, tracing the elegant lines with her eyes, imagining the process of creation, of bringing something beautiful and lasting into the world from nothing. In a small hidden pocket of her uniform, she kept a folded piece of paper and a pencil stub. Sometimes on her break, she would sketch a detail she'd admired, a curved staircase, an ornate window frame. These small acts of defiance were her secret life, a testament to the woman she was beneath the uniform, a creator trapped in the role of a cleaner. Her solitude was a constant companion, a presence as real as the cleaning cart she pushed through the silent nights. She ate her meals alone, simple sandwiches consumed in the stark, impersonal break room, the taste of loneliness more potent than the food itself. She watched the city from her apartment window, a million lights representing a million lives she would never intersect with, each one a story she was not a part of. This profound isolation had sharpened her perceptions, making her an astute observer of the human condition. She saw the desperation behind the bravado of the hotel guests, the fear in the eyes of the other staff members. She was an island, but she understood the tides that moved everyone around her. Time itself felt like an adversary. The large, ornate clock in the sovereign's lobby ticked with an infuriating slowness, each second a measure of her servitude. At home, the digital display on her microwave glowed a relentless red, counting down the hours until she had to return to the gilded cage. Time was not a river carrying her toward a brighter future. It was a stagnant pool in which she was trapped. Her life was measured in shifts completed, rooms cleaned, and bills paid.
There was no sense of progress, only the wearying repetition of survival, a circular path that always led back to the same place of quiet, gnawing desperation, with no escape in sight. Tonight, the feeling of being trapped was more acute than ever. Henderson had cornered her near the service elevator, his breath smelling of stale coffee and something sour. He'd found a microscopic smudge on a mirror in a suite she'd cleaned, holding it over her like a death sentence. "A little more attention to detail, Clara," he'd said, his hand brushing her arm. "We wouldn't want to lose such a valuable employee." The threat was clear. Then he'd handed her the final assignment, the penthouse suite, a last-minute addition. "Supposed to be empty," he'd smirked. "Just give it a final polish. A special guest is arriving tomorrow." The assignment felt like a punishment, a deliberate extension of her shift. As the elevator ascended in unnerving silence, Clara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The ride up was always a transition, lifting her from the grit of the real world into the rarefied air of the powerful. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a final ascent, a point of no return. She gripped the handle of her cart, her knuckles white, her reflection a pale, determined ghost in the polished brass doors. All she wanted was for this night to end. She stepped out onto the plush carpet of the penthouse floor, the silence absolute and unnerving, and pushed her keycard into the lock of the suite, unaware that she was about to unlock a door to a life she could never have imagined. The penthouse was no longer a workspace. It had become a gilded prison, its silence a crushing, tangible force. Clara remained frozen where Dante Moretti had left her, the steam from his shower having long since dissipated, leaving only the cold, hard reality of his words. Her cleaning cart stood by the bathroom door like a relic from a life that had ended just moments ago. She looked at her own hands, half expecting them to be trembling, but they were perfectly still. A strange, chilling calm had settled over her, the kind that follows a catastrophic event when the mind refuses to process the full scope of the disaster. She was a witness, a liability, and now she was his. He re-entered the living area not as the scarred, vulnerable man from the bathroom, but as the formidable figure she recognized from the hotel lobby.
Dressed in a flawlessly tailored black suit, he moved with an economy of motion that was both elegant and predatory. The fabric did little to hide the powerful physique beneath, but it was the stillness in his eyes that held all the authority. Two other men, equally well-dressed, but standing with the rigid posture of loyal sentinels, materialized from the shadows of the suite, their presence a quiet confirmation of his power. The air itself seemed to bend around him, charged with a respect so absolute it felt like fear. He was the center of this silent, dangerous universe. Dante stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her as if seeing her for the first time. There was no anger, no lust, only a cold, methodical assessment. "You will not speak of what you saw," he said, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that seemed to absorb all sound in the room. "You will not attempt to leave this suite. Your duties will continue, but they will be confined to this floor. Only here." It was not a negotiation or a threat. It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as gravity. He was rewriting the rules of her existence, and she was powerless to object, her own world shrinking to the size of this opulent cage. Clara's throat was tight, her breath shallow. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scream, to fight back, but her body was locked in place by the sheer force of his will. She met his gaze, and in the cold steel of his eyes, she saw a profound loneliness, a weariness that seemed as old as the scars on his skin. It was a fleeting glimpse into the man behind the monster, a fissure in his perfect, impenetrable facade. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an act of submission, but an acknowledgement of survival. In that moment of silent compliance, she held on to the one thing he couldn't take from her dignity. Suddenly, the suite door burst open, and Mr. Henderson stormed in, his face flushed with petty rage. "Hayes, what in God's name are you doing? I've been calling your radio for 10 minutes, he barked, his eyes fixed on her, completely oblivious to the other occupants of the room. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "This is the most important suite in the hotel, and you decide to take a nap? You're finished. Pack your things." His voice was a vulgar intrusion, a violation of the room's cold sanctity, and his touch felt like a brand of humiliation on her skin. Dante Moretti did not move. He simply watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable, his stillness a gathering storm. Henderson, lost in his own tirade, continued to berate Clara, his spittle flying. Then, a single word from Dante cut through the air, sharp and cold as a shard of ice. "Enough." It wasn't loud, but it carried an absolute authority that silenced Henderson instantly. The manager froze, his hand still on Clara's arm, and slowly turned. His face drained of all color as he finally comprehended the man standing before him, recognizing the ghost whose name was only ever whispered in fear. In that charged silence, Dante's gaze shifted from the terrified manager to Clara. It was a long, deliberate look that stripped away everything until all that was left was her. He saw the faint tremor in her hand, the defiant spark in her eyes that refused to be extinguished by Henderson's abuse, and the quiet strength that held her upright. He saw the woman, not the housekeeper. And Clara, looking back, felt an involuntary shiver that had nothing to do with fear. For a split second, she felt seen, truly seen, by the most dangerous man she had ever met. It was a terrifying and profoundly intimate connection forged in a moment of shared contempt for a lesser man. Without breaking his gaze from Clara, Dante gave a subtle, almost invisible flick of his head toward Henderson. One of his men stepped forward, his movements fluid and silent. He placed a heavy hand on Henderson's shoulder, a gesture that was both a suggestion and an unbreakable command. The manager stumbled backward, releasing Clara's arm as if it were on fire. Not another word was spoken as he was silently escorted from the room, his small tyranny utterly dismantled. Dante had intervened. He had protected her, not out of kindness, but for a reason she couldn't begin to fathom, shattering his own code of detached observation. The heavy door clicked shut, plunging the suite back into a deep, resonant silence. But the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just the silence of power, but the silence of a shared, dangerous secret. An unspoken line had been drawn, and he had placed her on his side of it, binding her to him with an invisible thread of protection and peril. Dante held her gaze for one more moment before turning and walking toward the large windows overlooking the city, his back to her once more. He had dismissed her without a word, yet his presence was more commanding than ever, leaving her to grapple with the terrifying implications of his actions. Clara stood alone in the center of the vast living room, the warmth of Henderson's grip on her arm fading, replaced by a deep, internal chill. The faint masculine scent of sandalwood and expensive wool lingered in the air, an indelible reminder of Dante Moretti. She could still feel the weight of his stare, a look that had seen past her uniform and into the very core of her being. Her old life, with its simple, suffocating routines, was gone forever. She was now a permanent resident in the lion's den, and she was beginning to understand that the monster who had caged her was also the only one who could protect her from the world outside. The days that followed bled into one another, each a long, silent stretch of time measured by the rising and setting of a sun she could only see through floor-to-ceiling windows. The penthouse became her entire world, a luxurious cage where the silence was broken only by the distant hum of the city and the soft, measured footsteps of Dante Moretti when he was present. Clara clung to her routine with a fierce desperation, polishing marble and cleaning glass as if the simple, repetitive acts could restore a sense of order to her shattered reality. She worked with her head down, trying to make herself small and invisible again, but she knew it was a futile effort. She was no longer a ghost. She was a fixture, a permanent, silent witness in his gilded sanctuary. Dante was often a phantom presence, a shadow in the periphery. He would sit for hours in a large leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, reviewing documents or simply staring out at the city lights. At first, Clara was paralyzed by his proximity, her movements stiff and uncertain. But as time wore on, a strange, tense rhythm developed between them. She would clean around him, the soft swish of her cloth the only sound in the room. She could feel his eyes on her, not with the leering gaze of Henderson, but with a quiet, unnerving intensity. It was an analytical look, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle, to understand the quiet dignity with which she performed her menial tasks. His presence was a constant, low-grade hum of danger, yet it was his absence that she found more unsettling. When he was gone for a day or two, the vast suite felt unnervingly empty, the silence heavier and more oppressive. She found herself listening for the sound of the private elevator, her body tensing with a mixture of dread and a strange, unbidden anticipation. This realization horrified her. She was becoming accustomed to her captor, her fear slowly being eroded by a dangerous curiosity about the man who held her life in his hands. He was a monster, she reminded herself, a man whose power was built on violence and fear. But the memory of his eyes, so full of ancient weariness, complicated that simple truth. One evening, he found her in the library, a small room lined with dark wood and filled with the scent of old paper. She wasn't cleaning. A large leather-bound book of architectural drawings lay open on the table, and she was tracing the lines of a blueprint with her fingertip, her expression one of profound, wistful concentration. She was so lost in the image that she didn't hear him enter. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes.
He saw not the housekeeper, but the architect she might have been, a glimpse of a soul unburdened by circumstance. When she finally sensed him and pulled her hand back as if burned, he said nothing, simply turning and walking away, leaving the heavy silence to rush back in. The next day, a meal was left for her on the kitchen island. It wasn't the simple staff food she had been given before. It was a delicate, artfully arranged dish from one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, still warm. There was no note, no explanation. The gesture was profoundly disorienting. Was it an act of kindness, a reward for her compliance, or was it another, more subtle assertion of his power, a reminder that he controlled every aspect of her existence, down to the very food she ate? She ate the meal slowly, each bite a mixture of exquisite flavor and a bitter taste of confusion. She felt as though he were studying her, testing her reactions to his calculated moves in this silent, dangerous game. He began speaking to her, not in conversations, but in brief, clipped commands or questions that demanded simple answers. The coffee, black. Has anyone called the landline? Is the temperature in here acceptable? Each interaction was a small stone dropped into the silent pool of their cohabitation, sending ripples of tension through the air. Clara answered with a quiet, respectful "yes, sir" or "no, sir," her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. She refused to let him see her fear, sensing instinctively that her composure was the only armor she had left. He seemed to respect this, his questions never straying into the personal, maintaining a formal, impenetrable barrier between them. The tension between them was a physical entity, an invisible current that crackled in the space they shared. It was in the way she would hold her breath when he walked past her, the scent of his cologne a subtle assault on her senses. It was in the way his gaze would sometimes linger on her face for a fraction of a second too long, a silent acknowledgement that intensified the charged atmosphere. She felt like a tightrope walker, balanced precariously over a chasm of unknown depth, where one wrong move, one misread signal could send her plummeting. Her fear was constant, but it was now threaded with a dangerous, magnetic fascination with the man who was both her jailer and her protector. One rainy afternoon, she was replacing a book on a high shelf in his office when her foot slipped on the small stepladder. She lost her balance, a small gasp escaping her as she started to fall. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, he was there, crossing the room in 2 long strides. His hands shot out, not grabbing her, but steadying her, one firm hand on her waist, the other on her arm. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and solid strength through the thin fabric of her uniform. For a breathless second, they were frozen, his touch a brand against her skin, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was thick with everything unspoken between them. He released her just as quickly, stepping back and creating an immediate, cold distance. His face was a mask of unreadable control, but she saw the slight clench in his jaw, the flicker of something deep and turbulent in his eyes before he shielded it away. "Be careful," he said, his voice a low rasp, rougher than usual. He turned and walked back to his desk without another word, leaving her trembling on the ladder, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. That brief, accidental contact had shattered the fragile barrier between them, revealing the volatile current of attraction and danger that lay just beneath the surface of their silent arrangement. His internal conflict was becoming a palpable force in the suite. She would catch him watching her with an expression of intense, frustrated contemplation, as if she were a problem he could not solve. He was a man accustomed to control, to a world of clear lines and brutal certainties. But she was an anomaly. Her quiet resilience, her unyielding moral core, and the complete absence of guile in her eyes seemed to disarm him. He saw in her a reflection of the innocence he had lost, a reminder of a humanity he had long ago buried under layers of violence and guilt. She was a mirror, and he was beginning to hate and crave what he saw. Clara, too, was at war with herself. Every rational part of her mind screamed that Dante Moretti was a killer, a man who moved in a world of darkness she could never comprehend. She had seen the cold, ruthless glint in his eyes when he took calls, his voice dropping to a low, menacing murmur. Yet she had also seen him stand perfectly still for 10 minutes, watching a lone bird on the balcony, his expression softened by a profound and startling melancholy. She was terrified of the monster, but she was drawn, against all her better judgment, to the slivers of the man she sometimes saw, the wounded soul hiding behind the impenetrable walls of power. The invisible threads binding them grew tighter, woven from shared silences, stolen glances, and the charged energy of their proximity.
He started leaving architectural magazines on the coffee table, a silent acknowledgement of the passion he had witnessed in the library. She, in turn, began to anticipate his needs, having his black coffee ready before he asked or leaving a bottle of water on his desk during his late nights.
These were not acts of servitude, but a new, unspoken language they were developing, a way of communicating across the vast, dangerous divide that separated their worlds. It was a fragile, perilous intimacy, built in the heart of a gilded cage. He was drawn to her empathy, a quality he viewed as a weakness in his world, but found himself unable to resist in her. One night, a brutal thunderstorm raged over the city, the sound of thunder like cannon fire. He found her standing by the window, not looking at the lightning, but down at the street below, watching people scramble for cover. "You feel for them," he stated, his voice quiet behind her. She turned, surprised by his presence. "They're just trying to get home," she whispered. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment, he looked like a man starving for a feeling he could no longer remember how to access. Her simple, unadorned compassion was a light in his world of shadows, and it was beginning to destabilize him completely. The precarious balance of their world was shattered by the arrival of two men late one night. They were not Dante's usual associates. These men were different, colder, with the dead eyes of predators who enjoyed their work. Dante met them in the living area while Clara was instructed to remain in the kitchen out of sight. The conversation was low and tense, the words inaudible, but the tone was laced with barely concealed violence. Clara could feel the menace radiating from the other room, a chilling promise of brutality. It was a stark, terrifying reminder that while she might be safe from the world with him, she was now living at the very center of his danger. After the men left, a heavy, malevolent silence descended upon the penthouse. Dante stood by the window for a long time, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He was the unquestioned king of his domain, but she had just witnessed a challenge to his throne, a threat that had breached the sanctity of his fortress. He was vulnerable, and this realization was more terrifying than his power. The danger was no longer an abstract concept. It was here, in this room, a living, breathing thing that had looked at her with empty, merciless eyes as the men had passed the kitchen doorway. He finally turned from the window, his face pale and drawn under the dim lights. His eyes found hers across the room, and the look in them was raw, stripped of his usual control. It was a look of cold fury, but also something else, a protective instinct so fierce it was almost feral. He walked over to a small, ornate desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a thin manila file. He approached her slowly, his steps measured and deliberate, his gaze never leaving her face. The air crackled with a new, more immediate form of tension, a sense that the game had just changed, and the rules were about to be violently rewritten. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the cold radiating from him. He didn't speak. He simply placed the file on the kitchen island between them. On the cover was a single name, typed in stark black letters, Arthur Vance. The name of the developer who had destroyed her father, the man who was the source of all her family's pain. She stared at it, her blood turning to ice. Dante's voice was a low, chilling whisper, devoid of all emotion. He is one of the men who was just here. He now owes me a debt he cannot pay. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon her. Tell me what you want me to do with him. The file lay between them, a flat, unassuming object that held the power to annihilate a life. Clara stared at the name, Arthur Vance, and felt a cold, familiar anger rise within her, the ghost of her father's grief. Dante Moretti was offering her a weapon, a key to the kind of justice her world had always denied her. He was giving her a chance to become like him, to answer pain with pain, to balance the scales with blood. The silence in the room was a crucible, and he was watching to see what would emerge from the fire, a victim seeking vengeance or something else entirely. He stood perfectly still,
his expression a mask of detached curiosity. This was a test, a final, definitive measure of her character. In his world, weakness was a currency, and vengeance was a right. He expected her to weep, to rage, to ask for the man's ruin. He was offering her a transaction, a dark gift to settle the debt of her imprisonment. By accepting, she would become complicit, her moral clarity forever stained by his methods, binding her to him in a way that simple captivity never could. His gaze was heavy, analytical, waiting for the predictable human response. He was the devil, offering a deal, and he had no doubt she would take it, for he had never met a soul who hadn't. But as Clara looked at the name, she didn't see the face of the man who had destroyed her family. Instead, she saw her father's hands, calloused, gentle, always building, never breaking. He was a creator, a man who believed in the integrity of his work, in the honesty of a promise. To ask for vengeance would be to desecrate his memory, to become the very thing he had despised.
The anger inside her did not vanish, but it transformed into a quiet, resolute strength. She would not honor her father's life by celebrating another's destruction. That was not her justice. She finally lifted her eyes from the file and met his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper, but a clear, steady tone that cut through the oppressive silence of the suite. "I want you to do nothing," she said. The words hung in the air, a shocking act of defiance. "Taking something from him won't give me back what I lost. It won't bring back my father's spirit. It will just make me a part of your world." She pushed the file back toward him, a small, definitive slide across the polished marble. "And I will not let him be the reason I lose myself, too." It was a declaration of her own unbreakable code, a moral line drawn in the sand of his dark kingdom. For the first time since she had met him, Dante Moretti looked truly unguarded. A flicker of profound disbelief crossed his features, quickly suppressed, but not before she saw it. He had expected tears or fury, but he was met with a strength he couldn't comprehend, a moral fortitude that was utterly alien to him. Her refusal was not weakness, it was an act of immense power. She had looked into the abyss he offered and chosen to walk away, not out of fear, but out of principle. In that moment, he saw her not as a captive or a liability, but as a force of nature, an immovable object of light in his world of shadows, and it shook him to his very core. The moment was shattered by the sharp, metallic buzz of a burner phone on the desk. Dante's eyes snapped to the device, his focus instantly shifting, the mask of control falling back into place. He answered it, his back to her, listening intently. His side of the conversation was a series of clipped, guttural monosyllables. When? Where? A long pause. Then, a low, cold finality in his voice. No. He ended the call, the silence that followed even more menacing than before. The threat from the outside world had just become a clear and present danger. Vance and his associates were not waiting for his decision, they were making their own. He stood with his back to her, a statue of coiled tension. She could see the war playing out in the rigid line of his shoulders. The cold logic of his world demanded a simple, brutal response: eliminate the threat. And Clara, the unexpected catalyst, was now a complication, a piece on the board that didn't fit. He could sacrifice her, use her as bait, or simply erase her. But then he turned, and his eyes found hers. He saw the quiet, unyielding integrity she had just displayed, and he made a decision, an illogical, self-destructive, and profoundly human one. He was breaking the cardinal rule of his survival: never protect a weakness. He moved toward her, his presence overwhelming in the suddenly small space. He didn't speak. He reached out, and his fingers wrapped around her upper arm, his grip firm but not painful. It was not a gesture of ownership or anger, but a raw, desperate act of shielding. He pulled her slightly behind him, positioning his body as a physical barrier between her and the unseen danger outside the windows.
"Don't move from this room," he commanded, his voice a low growl, rough with an emotion she couldn't name. The touch was a lightning strike, a discharge of all the tension, fear, and forbidden connection that had been building between them. It was a vow made in flesh and bone. In his eyes, she saw the full weight of his transgression. He had just declared war not for territory or for profit, but for her. For the impossible, infuriating principle she embodied. She saw the man beneath the monster, a man so starved for a sliver of light that he would risk his entire empire to keep it from being extinguished. And he, looking down at her, saw the terror in her eyes mixed with a dawning, shocked understanding. He saw that she finally understood the truth. His protection was as dangerous as any threat, a gilded cage where the bars were forged from his own damnation. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had condemned them both. The sound of his own harsh breathing filled the silence. The immediate crisis had been diverted by a command spoken over a phone, but the consequences were now a living entity in the room with them. Nothing needed to be said. He had broken his code, and she had been the cause. He released her arm, but the heat of his touch lingered, a permanent brand on her skin. They stood in the aftermath, two people from different worlds, now inextricably bound by a single, reckless act of grace. The city lights glittered outside, oblivious to the silent, seismic shift that had just occurred, a shift that ensured neither of them could ever go back to who they were before. The aftermath of his decision was a cold, silent void. Dante stepped away from her, the protective warmth of his body replaced by an immediate, chilling distance. He walked back to the window, his silhouette a dark, rigid line against the glittering, indifferent city. The storm outside had passed, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the streetlights. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the raw emotion from moments before. "For you." He didn't turn to look at her. The words were a verdict, a final severing.
He was pushing her away, back into a world that no longer felt like hers, not out of cruelty, but as the ultimate, most painful act of protection. The gilded cage was being dismantled, and she was being exiled from the only place she had felt truly seen. Within the hour, one of his silent men, a man named Marco with impassive eyes, was at the door. There was no discussion, no room for questions. Clara was escorted down the private elevator, her few belongings in a simple bag provided for her. The journey through the city was a blur of rain-streaked lights and shadows viewed from the plush leather interior of a black sedan that moved like a phantom through the sleeping streets. She was taken to a modern, anonymous apartment building in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood she didn't recognize. The apartment was clean, furnished with tasteful but impersonal furniture, and utterly silent. It was another cage, safer and more comfortable than her old life, but a cage nonetheless, its bars forged from his absence. Her new life was a study in profound solitude. Days were measured by the slow, merciless ticking of a minimalist clock on the wall and the changing patterns of light on the floor. She would stand by the window, which looked out not onto a skyline, but onto the quiet, domestic lives of strangers, and feel a loneliness so vast it was a physical weight in her chest. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the charged, dangerous quiet of the penthouse. There, the silence had been alive, filled with his presence, with unspoken words and palpable tension. Here, it was empty, a dead space that amplified the sound of her own heartbeat and the echo of his last words, a constant reminder of the chasm he had placed between them. Meanwhile, Dante descended back into the cold mechanics of his empire. The penthouse, once his sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum. He moved through its silent, opulent rooms with a renewed ruthlessness, his focus absolute. The threat posed by Vance and his allies required his complete, undivided attention. He became a creature of pure strategy and violence, his actions swift and brutal, designed to cauterize the wound she had exposed in his defenses.
He met with his lieutenants, his voice a low, chilling instrument of command, his eyes harder and colder than ever. He was reinforcing the walls of his kingdom, burying the man who had risked everything for a housekeeper under layers of calculated brutality, fighting a war in the shadows to protect a light he could no longer allow himself to see. For Clara, the pain of his absence began to transform into a startling, painful lucidity. She had been terrified of him, but she now understood that the true danger had not been his violence, but his vulnerability. The memory of his touch, that brief, desperate moment he had shielded her with his own body, was an indelible brand on her soul. She replayed it over and over, not with fear, but with a dawning comprehension of its cost. He had shown her a piece of his broken humanity, and in doing so had been forced to lock it away forever. She was grieving not for a captor, but for the man he might have been, and for the woman she had become in the crucible of his world. Stronger, sadder, and irrevocably changed. One morning, a plain white envelope was slipped under her door. Inside, there was no note, only a bank statement and a deed. The statement showed a balance in an account under her name, a sum so large it was incomprehensible, more than enough to secure her mother's care for the rest of her life. The deed was for her father's old carpentry workshop, foreclosed years ago, now mysteriously paid in full. It was his way of communicating across the silence, a final, transactional act of care. It was blood money, a ghost's attempt to right the wrongs of a world he commanded. He was settling his accounts, paying for her silence, for her safety, for the damage he had caused, and the damage he had prevented. Clara held the papers in her hand, the crisp edges feeling sharp against her skin. There was no joy, no relief, only a deep, hollow ache. This was not a gift. It was a final wall being erected between them, a dismissal paid in gold. It was his way of saying goodbye, of pushing her so far away with his wealth that she could never find her way back. He was trying to give her back her old life, but he failed to understand that he had destroyed it forever. She could never go back to being the invisible woman, the quiet housekeeper. His world had taught her the true meaning of power, of sacrifice, and of a loneliness that no amount of money could ever fill. She let the papers fall onto the table, his final, empty gesture. In the penthouse high above the city, Dante stood in the library, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The war with Vance was over, a brief, brutal affair that had ended as all such things did in his world, with silence and a few new ghosts. But the victory felt hollow. The suite was clean, orderly, exactly as it had always been, but the soul of the place was gone. His eyes fell upon the leather-bound book of architectural drawings on the table, left exactly where she had last touched it. He ran his fingers over the cover, imagining the ghost of her touch, and for the first time in years, he felt the full, crushing weight of his own damnation. He was the undisputed king of his dark world, and he had never been more alone.
Clara stood before the mirror in the silent apartment. The woman looking back at her was different. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, unyielding resolve. The vulnerability was still there, but it was now tempered with a steel she didn't know she possessed. She had survived Dante Moretti. She had seen the monster and the man, and had walked away with her soul intact. She would not live as his pensioner, a ghost kept in a gilded cage. His money was a chain, and she was finally ready to break it. Her father had taught her to build, not to accept what was given. And she would build a new life, one that was truly her own, far from the shadows of his world. She packed a single small bag, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and the picture of her parents. She left the envelope with the bank statement and the deed on the immaculate kitchen counter. She opened the apartment door, took one last look at the silent, empty room, and walked out without a glance back. Down on the street, a soft rain had begun to fall, washing the city clean. She pulled up the collar of her jacket and started walking, her destination unknown.
She was just one person in a city of millions, but for the first time in a long time, she was not invisible. She was free, and the silence that followed her was not one of emptiness, but of quiet, unwritten possibility. 6 months passed, each one a quiet testament to her resilience. Clara had found work with a small, independent architectural firm that specialized in restoring historic buildings. She spent her days surrounded by the smell of old wood and drafting paper, her hands covered in charcoal dust instead of cleaning chemicals. She had rebuilt her life not with Dante's money, which she never touched, but with the same quiet dignity and meticulous care she had once applied to polishing marble floors. The memory of the penthouse was a scar on her soul, a place of terror and a strange, painful tenderness. The ghost of Dante Moretti lived in the silent spaces of her memory, a melancholic ache for a connection that was as beautiful as it was impossible, a reminder of the darkness she had survived. From his throne of shadows, Dante watched her rebuild. He knew about the small firm, the modest apartment she rented with her own earnings, the way she sometimes paused on the street to sketch the arch of a forgotten doorway into a small notebook. His men, once instruments of intimidation, were now her unseen guardians, a silent perimeter of protection she would never know existed. He had dismantled Arthur Vance's life with surgical precision, not for vengeance, but to clear the path for her. This was his penance, the only form of redemption he could offer, to use the machinery of his dark world to protect her light, to ensure her freedom remained absolute. He had caged a bird only to discover that its true beauty was in its flight, and now he would spend his life making sure the skies remained clear. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon in Central Park. Clara sat on a bench near the Bethesda Terrace, her sketchbook open on her lap, capturing the way the late afternoon sun illuminated the stone carvings. The city was a symphony of distant sirens, laughing children, and rustling leaves. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the world around her quiet down, the ambient energy shifting as if a predator had entered the field. But then a shadow fell over her page, and she felt a familiar chill, a sudden drop in the air's temperature. She looked up slowly, her heart a heavy, painful drum against her ribs. Across the promenade, standing perfectly still by the fountain, was Dante Moretti. He was just looking at her. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the space between them charged with the weight of everything unspoken. His face was the same, impassive, carved from stone, but his eyes were different. The cold, assessing steel was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness and something that looked achingly like regret. He was not the monster from the penthouse, nor the king of the underworld. He was just a man, bearing the scars of his choices. And in her own gaze, he saw no fear. He saw the woman she had become, unbroken, resilient, her spirit shining with a quiet strength that his darkness had failed to extinguish. It was a silent, mutual absolution, and acknowledgement that they had saved each other in ways the world would never understand. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a concession, a farewell, and a benediction. Then, without another moment's hesitation, he turned and melted back into the flow of the city, a ghost returning to his shadows, leaving her alone with the sound of the fountain and her own unsteady breath. Her gaze drifted from where he had stood to the empty space on the bench beside her. Lying there was a single antique drafting pencil made of dark polished mahogany, its silver tip gleaming. It was not a grand gesture of wealth, but a small, deeply personal acknowledgement of her soul, of the creator he had seen hiding in the cleaner. A gift not from the mafia boss, but from the man who remembered her dreams. Clara looked at the pencil, a simple, elegant tool of creation. She didn't reach for it yet. Not yet. She simply acknowledged its presence, a final, silent word in their impossible story. He had given her back a future, and she, in her defiance and grace, had given him a memory of the man he could have been. Their two worlds could never meet,
But for one brief moment, they had collided, and the light sparked from the impact had changed them both forever. Redemption wasn't about forgiveness. It was about the choice to protect the light, even if you were destined to live in the dark. Their story shows that even in the deepest shadows, humanity can survive. And if their journey moved you, show your support by liking this video, sharing it, and telling us in the comments what this ending meant to you.